Welcome to Boring Pastimes for Sleep. This is a long, quiet journey through forgotten corners of the past. Here, we will wander slowly along dusty trade routes, through markets where nothing much happens, and into the daily lives of people whose names are mostly forgotten. There are no battles to keep you awake, no heroes demanding attention. Instead, you'll hear about sacks of grain being weighed, watchtowers slowly sinking into the sand, the creak of carts, the smell of wool, and the patient work of scribes, merchants, and guards. Like the Silk Roads themselves, this journey does not rush. It moves at the pace of walking, of resting, of pausing to observe small details. You are invited to listen, to drift, to let the quiet rhythm of history carry you towards sleep. So settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let us begin. Imagine, for a moment, that you are not a merchant prince, nor a bold explorer, but a tired traveler, one of thousands, who trudged along the endless arteries of the Silk Roads. The name itself suggests treasures and splendor, but for most people, the road meant sore feet, dry throats, and the slow plodding of camels, whose bells clinked with a rhythm that could lull even the most watchful guard into a half-dream. The camel caravan was the backbone of overland trade, particularly through Central Asia, where deserts stretched like seas and mountains loomed like silent walls. Samarkand, that ancient city, often described as a glittering jewel, was in truth both splendid and ordinary. For every diplomat who admired its mosaics, there were hundreds of stable hands cleaning dung, scribes tallying sacks of grain, and cooks stirring watery stews for men too tired to notice the taste. The journey began far away, sometimes in the valleys of China, sometimes at the ports of the Mediterranean, but Samarkand was a hub, a place where many routes converged. Caravans were not loose gatherings of merchants, as some romantic tales suggest, but carefully organized groups. Each had its leader, often a man of stern practicality rather than great charisma. His task was to keep people alive, animals fed, and goods safe. Camels were expensive investments, and the men who walked beside them often owned little beyond the clothes on their backs. A caravan typically included 200 to 500 camels, though sometimes smaller groups of 50 or so trudged along together. The animals were not glamorous. Their smell was strong and often unpleasant. Their padded feet, however, made them perfect for desserts. A good camel could carry about 400 pounds of goods, whether that meant bolts of silk, sacks of salt, or bundles of dried fish. They walked at a steady pace of about 25 miles a day. To you, listening now, that might sound respectable, but on a road of thousands of miles, progress felt painfully slow. One of the most boring but essential parts of caravan life was water. Each stretch of desert was measured not in miles, but in wells. Merchants studied maps not for beauty or politics, but for the locations of cisterns and oases. A miscalculation meant death. Water was drawn up in leather buckets, often brackish, sometimes sweet, and carried in goatskins tied to the sides of camels. Salt deposits around wells were a common sight, left behind by years of evaporation. At each stop, travelers inspected the animals' hooves and adjusted saddles, checking straps for wear. It was routine, dull, and necessary, the kind of detail on which empires quietly depended. Food was equally uninspiring. Most caravans carried flour, dried fruits, and salted meat. Rice or millet might appear if the road passed through agricultural regions. Cooking was done in iron pots over small fires of gathered brushwood or dung. The taste was secondary to the calories. Still, there were small comforts: a handful of raisins after a long march, or a piece of hard cheese shared between companions. Tea, though common in the East, spread slowly westward through these very caravans. Imagine the weary relief of a warm cup after days of dry bread. At night, the caravan formed a ring. Camels knelt in lines, goods stacked carefully in the center, guards pacing at the perimeter. Robbery was a constant fear. Bandits were rarely noble rebels. Most were simply desperate men with little to lose. The guards kept fires low, preferring quiet watchfulness to drawing attention. Many travelers fell asleep, not to silence, but to the steady grumble of camels, the coughs of men, and the occasional cry of a child bundled under blankets. Samarkand itself was both a destination and a checkpoint. Its bazaars were crowded with goods from every direction: Chinese silk, Indian spices, Persian glass, and Russian furs. Yet the glamour was uneven. For every shop of glittering wares, there were 10 stalls selling onions, wool, or cheap pottery. City officials collected taxes with patience but little mercy, carefully weighing sacks and marking tallies on long scrolls. The noise of coins counted, and the scratching of reed pens against paper echoed through merchant houses long after sunset. Daily life along the route was a mixture of monotony and subtle variety. The soundscape was dominated by camel bells, leather creaking, and voices calling in many tongues. Travelers learned to recognize greetings in Persian, Turkic, Chinese, and Arabic. Deals were struck through gestures and numbers, even when words failed. To walk the road was to live in a world where cultures blended quietly, not through dramatic encounters, but through the exchange of small necessities: a needle, a loaf of bread, a strip of cloth. What made this life bearable was routine. You would wake before dawn, load the camels in silence, march for hours, stop for water, eat quickly, and continue until dusk. Each day blurred into the next, measured not by excitement but by survival. Yet it was through this quiet repetition that the road endured for centuries. Goods moved, ideas spread, and empires rose and fell, but the travelers kept walking, step after step, bell after bell. And so the question remains: was it the treasures of silk and spice that truly held the Silk Road together? Or was it the patient endurance of ordinary men and women who accepted boredom as the price of survival? If the camel was the backbone of the Silk Road, then the people walking beside it were its sinews, joints, and muscles, flexible, sometimes strained, but holding the whole enterprise together. A caravan was not just a loose crowd, it was a society. In miniature, one that mirrored larger empires, but in far more modest terms. Understanding this community requires looking closely at its members. From the caravan master down to the child clinging to her mother's robes. The caravan master, often called a caravan bashi, was both respected and quietly resented. His duties were practical: setting the pace, negotiating with local officials, hiring guards, and settling disputes. Few wanted his position, for it carried responsibility without glamour. If water ran out or bandits struck, the blame fell squarely upon him. Yet he rarely commanded through speeches or flourishes of authority. Instead, he spoke in clipped sentences, issued orders as though they were everyday chores, and reminded people of distances, rations, and debts. Beneath him stood the merchants, owners of goods. These men were not always wealthy. Some managed a single camel's load, while others might control entire strings of animals laden with cloth, spice, or gems. They wore practical robes, often patched, for fine garments would only attract thieves. Their chief concern was the safety of their cargo. They checked bundles obsessively, tying knots twice, marking them with seals of wax or simple cloth tags. To them, the road was less a journey than a long calculation of risk versus profit. Alongside the merchants traveled guards. Many were hired from local tribes, Turkic horsemen, Persian archers, or simply young men eager for pay. They were not a disciplined army, but they provided muscle, carrying spears, bows, or short swords. At night they rotated watches, walking in slow circles around the camp. The boredom of guard duty was legendary. One traveler recorded that the most dangerous moment was not when bandits attacked, but when a guard fell asleep and failed to give the alarm. Still, their presence deterred most small groups of thieves, for robbers preferred easy prey. Perhaps the most overlooked figures were the cooks and laborers. A caravan needed food, not only for men, but for animals. Barley, dates, and fodder had to be measured, boiled, or distributed. A cook's fire was the hub of evening life. Around it, men warmed hands, mended sandals, and muttered prayers. The food was rarely exciting: thin porridge, flat bread, beans, if fortune allowed. Yet the cook determined morale as much as the caravan master did. A bitter stew on a cold night could lower spirits more than a sandstorm. Another indispensable role belonged to the translators. On the Silk Roads, language was both barrier and bridge. A caravan moving from China toward Persia might need 3, or 4 interpreters, each linking one tongue to the next. These men carried little wealth, but great value. For without them, no bargain could be struck, no toll negotiated, no warning understood. They lived in the strange in-between, trusted by none entirely, yet relied upon by all. Then there were the animal handlers, the boys and men who walked beside camels, tugging ropes, checking straps, whispering sharp commands to stubborn beasts. Their work was repetitive, their backs bent with constant lifting. At night, they brushed camels, applied salves to sores, and tightened ropes. The health of the caravan's animals determined its survival more than the strength of its men. A dead camel meant lost goods, lost money, and perhaps lost lives. Not every traveler had a defined task. Families sometimes joined caravans for protection, mothers with infants, widows seeking new homes, or wandering scholars in search of distant monasteries. For them, the road was less about commerce and more about shelter. They were tolerated, occasionally pitied, and sometimes resented for consuming resources without adding profit. Yet their presence reminded everyone that the Silk Road was not only about goods, but about the slow migration of people, customs, and ideas. Caravan life also had its quiet hierarchies. Merchants ate slightly better, their tents larger, and their bedding softer. Guards often sat together, sharing jokes and sharpening blades. Cooks and handlers were treated as menials, Yet when food was scarce or camels fell ill, their importance suddenly rose. Social order shifted with circumstance, like sand under wind, tirely stable, always adjusting. The monotony of the march was broken by small rituals. In the morning, prayers were whispered in many languages. Some bowed toward Mecca, others burned incense, while still others muttered Buddhist sutras. At midday, a rest stop meant the brief clatter of bowls and cups. At night, the fire circles became quiet stages. Someone might sing, another recite a tale from home, or a guard boast of past victories. These were not grand performances, but murmured exchanges, half lost in the crackle of firewood. There was also the constant arithmetic of the journey. Merchants counted coins, weighed sacks, and adjusted ledgers by lamplight. Tally marks filled wooden boards, wax tablets, or scraps of parchment. Each entry represented not a fortune, but a survival. How much barley remained, how many bolts of cloth were sold, how much tax was owed. It was not dramatic, yet these quiet numbers kept the wheels of trade turning. Danger, though ever present, came more often from within than without. Arguments broke out over grazing land, delayed departures, or missing goods. A snapped rope could spark accusations of theft. A sick camel might become a matter of heated debate. Should it be left behind or forced onward? The caravan master often acted as judge, listening to grievances with weary patience and with satisfaction. More often, they ended with grudging acceptance. And yet, despite quarrels, the caravan moved. Perhaps the true secret of survival was not courage, but compromise, the dull ability to endure discomfort, to swallow pride, and to keep walking. Step after step, day after day, the road required patience more than heroism. Samarkand, when finally reached, was a reward, not because it was splendid, but because it meant rest. Here, roles shifted once again. Merchants haggled in the bazaar, guards found taverns, cooks sold their services to new groups, and translators sought fresh employment. The caravan dissolved into the city's noise, only to reform again days or weeks later. This cycle repeated endlessly. Caravans rose and fell like waves upon the desert shore. Each group was unique in its faces, but alike in its structure. A master, merchants, guards, cooks, translators, handlers, and wanderers. Together, they formed a fragile community stretched across sand and stone. The question that lingers is this: did the Silk Road thrive because of the exotic treasures that dazzled courts, or because ordinary people accepted the dull weight of duty, keeping their places in this small, moving society? Samarkand, the name carries a weight of romance today, conjuring visions of domes, mosaics, and fabled riches. Yet, for those who actually trudged into its gates after weeks or months on the road, the city's greatest gift was not beauty, but relief. Relief in the form of clean water, shade, a proper bed, or, at least, a mat on stone instead of sand, and the sound of voices that did not come only from the same weary companions. Samarkand was not merely a jewel on the Silk Road. It was a hinge, a marketplace, and a checkpoint where the dull mechanics of trade quietly turned. The first encounter for most caravans was not the bazaar, but the officials at the gates. Samarkand belonged to empires in succession: the Persians, the Arabs, the Mongols, and the Timurids, but regardless of ruler. Officials remained the same, men with ledgers, weights, and pens. They examined goods with practiced eyes, lifting lids, poking sacks, and sniffing jars. Taxes were assessed not in fiery speeches, but in careful measurements. A merchant might wait hours, while a clerk weighed spices on small brass scales, adjusted a counterweight, and scratched notes onto a board. No one enjoyed the process, yet it was the lifeblood of empire. Taxes paid for roads, for guards, and for the very officials whose presence irritated travelers. Once inside, the caravan scattered into the bazaars. These were not elegant halls, but sprawling collections of stalls, awnings, and courtyards. Goods from every corner of the known world jostled for space. Silk lay beside wool, cinnamon beside onions, turquoise beside glass beads. Yet the glamour was deceptive. The majority of trade involved the ordinary sacks of barley, rolls of felt, leather straps, and copper tools. Even spices, so treasured in distant lands, were bought in small amounts for local kitchens as much as for export. The bazaar smelled of dust, sweat, roasting meat, and ink. Trade itself was slow, deliberate, and almost mathematical. Bargaining was less about shouting than about endurance. Two men might sit for hours, sipping tea, discussing everything but the price, before finally agreeing on a figure that both could tolerate. Translators shifted from tongue to tongue, repeating numbers, clarifying terms, sometimes introducing their own fees with a subtle cough. Coins clinked, scales tipped, seals of clay or wax were pressed onto bundles. Nothing here was rushed, for haste invited mistakes. For caravan members, life in Samarkand meant separation by role. Merchants stayed longest, for they needed to sell old goods and purchase new. They rented storage in caravanserais, those great inns designed like fortresses, with high walls, locked gates, and courtyards large enough to hold dozens of camels. Inside, men slept on wooden platforms or mats, their goods stacked nearby. The air was thick with smoke from cooking fires and the smell of damp hides. It was not luxurious, but it was secure. Guards, suddenly free of their duties, often drifted into taverns or open courtyards where wine was poured and dice rattled. Some spent their wages quickly, others saved for future employment. They were transient by nature, moving from one caravan to the next, always seeking the road. Cooks and handlers found temporary work in the city, stirring pots in small kitchens, mending saddles, or hauling loads for merchants too tired to lift their own. For them, Samarkand was not an exotic wonder, but a place of hard labor, slightly better paid than the road. And then there were the official scribes. These men sat in narrow rooms along the bazaar, copying contracts, recording debts, and issuing receipts. Theirs was a boring but vital role. Without written proof, disputes over weights, measures, or payments could fester into violence. The neat lines of ink, the seals pressed into clay, were the quiet glue that bound trade together. Empires depended not only on armies, but on clerks who spent their lives hunched over low desks, scratching with reed pens until their fingers cramped. Samarkand also reflected the diversity of the road. Mosques stood beside Christian churches and Buddhist shrines. Pilgrims paused here as well as merchants. Monks carrying scriptures in bundles of cloth stopped to rest in monasteries, while Muslim scholars debated theology in shaded courtyards. Languages overlapped in the streets: Persian, Sogdian, Turkic, Arabic, Chinese, and more. To live in Samarkand was to hear a constant murmur of tongues, none dominating entirely, all woven together like threads of a vast, dull but enduring tapestry. The rhythm of life in the city was not swift. Morning brought the opening of stalls, the shouts of porters, and the clatter of hooves on stone. Midday saw the press of trade at its height, coins and scales passing steadily from hand to hand. Evening brought a quieter hum, lamps flickering in stalls, as scribes finished contracts, while cooks ladled stews in At night the city rested uneasily, for thieves prowled as they did everywhere. Locks were checked, guards posted, and yet still some bundles disappeared into the dark. Perhaps the most striking thing for a weary-lashed traveler was the sense that Samarkand was both grand and ordinary. The Registan Square, with its magnificent facades and tilework, dazzled the eyes, but most of the city was mud brick, wooden beams, and dusty lanes. Children played in alleys, chickens scratched in courtyards, and water sellers trudged with skins slung over shoulders. Splendor existed, but it was built upon a foundation of everyday labor. For caravans, Samarkand was a pivot point. From here, goods might head westward toward Persia, south toward India, or east toward China. Each direction carried its own risks, climates, and expenses. Decisions were made slowly, over meals and ledgers, with merchants weighing not only profit but survival. Many chose to linger, waiting for the right season, for spring thaws or autumn harvests. The city became a place of pause, where the endless bells of camels fell silent for a time. And so, if you imagine yourself as one of these travelers, you would remember Samarkand, not for dazzling riches, but for the simple gift of rest. You would recall the weight of a full meal, the scratch of a pen writing your name into a ledger, the sound of many languages drifting through the streets. You would recall the dull but steady comfort of walls that kept the desert out when you left. Gathering once again with your caravan, you would hear the bells of camels resume their rhythm, reminding you that Samarkand was not an ending but a pause. The road stretched onward, as endless as ever, demanding the same patience, the same routine. And so the question lingers: was Samarkand truly great because of its monuments and mosaics, or because it offered weary travelers the one thing the road itself could never give: a moment to stop, breathe, and simply exist before the bells began again? When people today imagine the Silk Road, they often picture bolts of cloth, sacks of spice, and strings of camels swaying across the desert. Yet, along those same roads walked another kind of travelermen with shaved heads, worn sandals, and bundles not of silk but of manuscripts. These were monks and pilgrims, men of faith whose cargo was quieter but no less transformative. They carried paper, ink, and stories, often without fanfare, linking monasteries and temples just as surely as merchants linked markets and bazaars. The spread of religions: Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, and more depended not on the grand gestures of kings, but on the small persistence of these ordinary figures. They copied texts by hand, one character after another, their wrists cramping under the dim light of oil lamps. They bundled scrolls in cloth wrappings, tied them with cord, and packed them onto carts or the backs of donkeys. These fragile goods were not dazzling to the eye. A bundle of parchment looked far less impressive than a chest of silk. Yet the words inscribed on those parchments would outlast many empires. Take, for instance, the journey of Buddhist monks from India into Central Asia and China. From the first centuries of the Common Era, they traveled northward through mountain passes, carrying sutras, the teachings of the Buddha, on fragile palm leaf manuscripts. These were not durable objects. Pages cracked, edges frayed, ink faded in the dry air. Monks wrapped them carefully, often layering cloth upon cloth, and entrusted them to beasts of burden, as though they were treasures more precious than gold. To these travelers, the road was not a highway of commerce, but a pilgrimage of preservation. Along the way, they relied on the same infrastructure as merchants, caravanserais, oases, and city markets. But instead of negotiating prices, monks sought food and lodging in exchange for blessings, prayers, or simple labor. Many communities along the Silk Road welcomed them, for they brought not only faith but literacy. A monk with ink and paper could copy contracts, read letters, or teach children basic scripts. In this way, their value extended beyond religion. Paper itself was a cargo of immense importance. Invented in China, it slowly spread westward along these same roads. Unlike silk or spice, paper was not a luxury good, but a tool. Its production was laborious. Rags, bark, or mulberry fibers were pulped, soaked, pressed, and dried into sheets. These sheets were lighter than parchment, easier to produce than silk, and more versatile than clay tablets. Carried by merchants, adopted by monks, and eventually coveted by bureaucrats. Paper transformed the way ideas moved. A caravan with a load of paper might seem unremarkable, yet its impact on history was enormous, and with paper came ink. Simple carbon soot mixed with water and glue created a substance that could last for centuries if kept dry. Ink was packed in small cakes or sticks, ground against stones, and mixed fresh each day. Travelers carried them in pouches, wrapped carefully to prevent moisture. For a monk or scribe, ink was as essential as food. Without it, stories remained silent. With it, they could be spoken across time and distance. The act of writing on the road was rarely glamorous. Imagine a monk seated cross-legged in a dim chamber of a caravanserai, hunched over a low desk or board balanced on his knees. The sounds outside were of camels groaning, merchants arguing, and pots clattering over fire. Inside, there was only the slow scratch of a brush or reed pen. Each stroke required patience. Mistakes could not be erased easily. Sometimes, a single sheet would take hours to fill. And yet, monks endured, because each word was a step in carrying their tradition forward. The stories themselves varied. Buddhist sutras, Christian gospels, Persian tales, medical treatises, astronomical charts, all made their way across these roads in the hands of quiet pilgrims. Some carried scripture for devotion, others for teaching, still others for translation. Translation was one of the most arduous tasks. A monk might labor years over a single text, comparing words across languages, consulting with fellow travelers, trying to capture meaning without losing essence. In Dunhuang, that cave city along the Silk Road, entire libraries of such translated works were stored quiet, evidence of the long patience of these wanderers. Not all stories were sacred. Folk tales, fables, and lullabies traveled with them as well. A monk might know a children's tale from India, share it with a Persian translator who passed it on to a Chinese scribe. By the time it reached the other end of the road, the story had shifted in tone but carried the same structure, a moral about patience, kindness, or wit. These humble tales spread not because kings decreed them, but because tired pilgrims repeated them at firesides, soothing companions after long days of walking. Daily life for these monks and pilgrims was as monotonous as for any merchant. They rose with the sun, walked until midday, stopped at wells, and continued until dusk. Their possessions were few: a robe, a bowl, perhaps a small bundle of scrolls. They ate whatever was given: barley, porridge, millet gruel, dried apricots. When food was scarce, they fasted. Their wealth lay not in possessions, but in the knowledge they carried. Knowledge written in characters and stored in memory. The danger of the road was not only robbery or hunger, but forgetfulness. A text left in the dust, a bundle lost in a river, or a language misremembered could mean the erasure of centuries of thought. To guard against this, monks memorized long passages. Some could recite entire sutras or gospels from heart. In this way, even if paper burned or ink faded, the words themselves survived, passed from one tongue to another like an oral caravan. And so, as you picture the Silk Road, it is worth pausing to imagine not only the smell of spice and the shimmer of silk, but the quiet image of a monk with ink-stained fingers, pressing a brush to paper by the light of an oil lamp. His work was slow, repetitive, and too many onlookers dull. But it was through such dullness that civilizations remembered themselves. The lingering question is this: did the Silk Road carry its greatest treasures in silk and spice, or in the fragile words inked by anonymous hands, preserved by monks who walked patiently from one end of the world to the other? If the road itself was the body of trade, then the monasteries along it were its beating heart. These were the resting places for both merchants and monks. But for pilgrims and scribes, they were more than inns. They were sanctuaries of ink and memory. The dusty miles between caravanserais and mountain passes were places of survival. But within monastery walls, men bent their heads over manuscripts, quietly working to ensure that stories did not vanish into the wind. The most famous of these havens stood in Dunhuang, at the edge of the desert where the Silk Road split into northern and southern routes. Here, in caves carved into cliffs, monks created entire libraries. They painted walls with scenes of celestial Buddhas, but more importantly, they filled rooms with scrolls. Thousands upon thousands of manuscripts rested there: Buddhist sutras, legal records, contracts, dictionaries, calendars. Some were written in Chinese, others in Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Uyghur, and more. It was not only a treasury of faith, but of bureaucracy, medicine, and local life. And it was monks who painstakingly copied them, brushstroke by brushstroke. The work of translation was a discipline of patience. A single sutra arriving from India might be written in Sanskrit. A Chinese monk eager to read it could not simply learn a new language in a few weeks. Instead, teams of translators labored together. A foreign monk might recite the Sanskrit aloud, while a bilingual assistant explained its meaning in a mixture of tongues. Then, a Chinese scribe set it down in characters, smoothing, phrasing where needed. Each layer added the risk of error, but also the chance of adaptation. The result was not a perfect mirror of the original, but something alive, rooted in India, yet shaped by China. Ideas flowed like water into new vessels. Buddhism itself transformed as it moved eastward, absorbing local customs, reshaping rituals. The monks knew this, and yet they continued, for their task was not to preserve perfection, but to prevent loss. Better an adapted scripture than a forgotten one. Monasteries became hubs of quiet activity. Imagine the soundscape, the scratching of brushes on paper, the drip of melted wax into lamps, the shuffle of sandals across stone floors. Scribes dipped brushes into ink made from soot and glue, careful not to spill precious drops. Sheets of paper were pressed between wooden boards to dry. Finished scrolls were rolled, tied with cord, and stacked in bundles. Each scroll might take weeks to complete. To copy an entire canon required lifetimes. Yet monks accepted this as duty, not burden. It was not only religious texts that passed through their hands. Practical manuals traveled with them to medical recipes, agricultural calendars, astronomical observations. In one monastery, a scroll might contain both a sutra and instructions for treating fevers with herbs. For monks, knowledge was not neatly divided into sacred and secular. The act of writing itself was sacred, a way to preserve the fragile continuity of human life. Beyond Dunhuang, other centers flourished. In Kutcha, along the northern Silk Road, Buddhist monks composed music and drama as well as texts. Their performances carried stories in song, embedding sutras in melodies that merchants might remember long after they left. In Gandhara, further west, Buddhist art and texts mingled with Greek influence, creating images and ideas that traveled eastward through manuscripts and sculpture alike. The work of the monk scribes was not glamorous, but it was international. A traveler might pass through one monastery and hear prayers in Tibetan, then move on to another and hear chants in Persian or Syriac. Each community added to the patchwork of the Silk Road. Religion moved not as a single river, but as countless streams, some converging, some diverging, each carrying fragments of thought for the monks themselves. Daily life was austere. They rose before dawn, chanted, ate a bowl of porridge, and then began their labor. Hours were spent hunched over desks, backs stiff, eyes straining in dim light. In winter, fingers grew numb in the cold. In summer, flies buzzed over the ink bowls. Mistakes were inevitable. A wrong stroke could alter meaning entirely. Some monks developed systems of correctionating small notes in the margins, crossing out words with careful marks. Others destroyed flawed sheets rather than risk error. Meals were simple: barley bread, boiled greens, dried fruit, if available. Sometimes merchants donated rice or tea in gratitude for lodging. These small luxuries brightened long weeks of monotony. Yet the true rhythm of their lives came from repetition. Write, chant, copy, pray, eat, sleep, repeat. Monotony was not punishment, but devotion. Through it, words survived. Pilgrims, too, played their part. Unlike monks, they carried not libraries, but fragments perhaps, a single scroll, a prayer book, or a set of charms. Their journeys were acts of faith, seeking holy sites in India, shrines in Central Asia, or monasteries in China. Along the way, they spread stories orally, telling others of the temples they had visited, the relics they had seen. A pilgrim's tale, though less precise than a scribe's ink, carried emotion that no text could fix on paper. In this way, faith and story moved both in fragile ink and in living voice. The question of preservation always haunted them. Ink faded, paper crumbled, and languages shifted. Would their words endure? The discovery of the Dunhuang manuscripts centuries later suggests that, in many cases, they did. Thousands of scrolls survived not because they were grandly celebrated, but because monks sealed them away in a hidden library cave, forgotten for almost 1,000 years. It was a kind of accidental preservation, born not of glory, but of neglect. Still, even in their own time, monks knew the fragility of their work. They copied not because they believed their sheets would last forever, but because they knew they might not. Each copy was insurance, one more chance that the words might outlive fire, flood, or war. The labor was slow, the progress boring by most measures. Yet it was this slowness that allowed faith and story to travel across continents. When you picture the Silk Road, then imagine not only the bustle of bazaars, but also the dim quiet of monastery rooms, where monks bent their heads, filling page after page. Their world was one of dust, soot, ink, and silence. Yet it was through their hands that entire civilizations spoke to one another. And so the lingering thought is this: was the Silk Road truly a road of trade? Or was it, in equal measure, a road of translation where patient monks and scribes turned fragile sheets into bridges between distant worlds? If the Silk Road was a long and winding thread, Kashgar was one of its knots, an intersection where routes converged, where merchants paused, and where ordinary people brought baskets, bundles, and jars to sell. Yet unlike the grand visions of silk bolts or gem-studded caravans, much of Kashgar's trade was quiet, small, and frankly unremarkable. It was here, in the market stalls, tucked between mud-brick houses and shaded alleys, that the humble exchanges of daily life unfolded. A pinch of spice, a coil of thread, a pair of woolen socks, traded for a handful of dried apricots. To understand Kashgar, you must first picture its place. Nestled where the Tian Shan Mountains lean southward and the Taklamakan Desert spreads wide, the oasis town stood as a green pocket in a harsh landscape. Its survival depended on water from streams fed by wheat and barley grew in irrigated fields, and orchards yielded apricots, pomegranates, and mulberries. Around it, herders grazed sheep and goats on sparse pastures, shearing wool that would later become felt, yarn, and socks. It was not the wealth of empires that defined Kashgar's market, but the stubborn productivity of ordinary life. When merchants from afar arrived, dusty from weeks on the road, they often carried goods more glamorous than the locals could afford. Indian traders brought peppercorns in small cloth bags. Persian caravans offered rosewater. Chinese travelers unloaded porcelain bowls or medicinal rhubarb root. But the core of Kashgar's bazaar was not these luxuries. It was the items every household needed: salt, needles, soap, sandals, wool, and spices sold not in lavish sacks, but in pinches and spoonfuls. A woman might bring a bundle of socks, knitted from coarse wool, dyed with simple plant colors, brown, yellow, sometimes faint green. She spread them on a mat, waiting for passers-by to inspect the stitches. A shepherd, meanwhile, might arrive with sheep cheese wrapped in cloth, trading it for a packet of cumin seeds to flavor his family's stew. Children ran errands with coins clutched in fists, buying oil for lamps or thread for mending torn tunics. None of these exchanges would impress an imperial chronicler. Yet it was precisely these exchanges that allowed life to continue. The soundscape of the market was steady, rather than loud. The bray of donkeys tied to posts, the bargaining voices of women measuring grain by hand, the creak of wooden carts. Stallholders sat cross-legged behind low counters, weighing goods on small balances. A jar of honey might be swapped for a skein of dyed yarn. A pair of worn sandals could be exchanged for a bowl of dried mulberries. Cash was used, but barter remained common. Value was measured not only in coins but in usefulness. Spices, in particular, traveled in small amounts. Unlike the bales of silk imagined in tales, most households purchased only what they could afford: a few peppercorns, a pinch of saffron to color a festival dish, a small paper twist of cinnamon. Merchants sold them carefully, aware that each grain was precious. In the kitchens of Kashgar, these spices transformed otherwise plain stews of mutton and barley into something fragrant. A single clove might be tucked into bread dough, a sprig of dried coriander stirred into soup. Luxuries were stretched thin, turned into memory as much as flavor. Needles were another staple, perhaps more valuable to daily life than silk. Traders carried bundles of iron or bronze needles wrapped in cloth. Seamstresses inspected them one by one, ensuring the eyes were smooth and the points sharp. A single good needle might last a family for years, repairing wool garments, felt boots, and patched tents. Alongside them, thread sellers offered skeins spun from sheep's wool, twisted into thick cords or finer strands. Some were undyed, others colored with plant-based dyes: walnut husk for brown, madder root for red, indigo for blue. Woolen socks were a Kashgar specialty, born from necessity. Winters in the oasis were bitter, and herders relied on thick socks worn inside boots to keep warm on journeys across snow. Women knitted or stitched them from homespun yarn, decorating some with simple patterns of stripes or crosses. These socks were not luxuries, but they were valued by both locals and travelers. A merchant from Pharaoh of Samarkand might purchase several pairs to carry home, not because they were beautiful, but because they were durable. The rhythm of the market followed the week, swelling on designated days when villagers from nearby settlements gathered to sell surplus. On quieter days, only local buyers and sellers filled the stalls. Merchants traveling long distances planned their routes to arrive for the busy market days, when trade was brisk and variety greater. But even then, the heart of Kashgar's economy was not caravans of silk, but the steady hum of household exchange. Food items made up much of the bustle. Apricots dried in the sun were stacked in piles, traded as portable energy for travelers. Flatbreads baked in clay ovens were sold fresh each morning, their surfaces speckled with sesame seeds. Yogurt, thick and sour, was ladled from earthen jars into smaller containers. Spices, dairy, bread, wool, and tools, together they formed the unglamorous backbone of the market. One might imagine that the Silk Road was defined by emperors and generals. But in Kashgar it was shepherds, farmers, and housewives who kept it alive. They sold what they could spare, bought what they lacked, and in doing so maintained the web of exchange. Without socks, needles, and food, the great caravans themselves could not survive the road. And so we might pause here and ask, when we think of Kashgar's marketplace, should we picture shimmering silks and exotic gems? Or rather the slow and steady barter of socks for apricots, needles for cheese, cumin seeds for wool? Which trade, after all, was truly more essential to survival? Imagine walking slowly, not as a hurried merchant with a caravan to lead, but as an observer who pauses at each stand, noting the simple textures that carried the rhythm of life. But the market shaded itself with woven reed mats stretched across wooden poles. Beneath them, artisans displayed their trades. The sound of metal striking metal echoed from the blacksmith's corner, where men hammered nails, shaped knives, and repaired broken cooking pots. Sparks danced for a moment in the air before vanishing into dust. A family might not afford silk, but they could afford a new sickle blade for harvest, and such purchases mattered more for survival than any luxury. Across from the blacksmiths, women sold dyed wool yarn coiled into neat bundles. Their fingers were often stained with plant colors: reds from madder, yellows from safflower, browns from walnut husks. Buyers tugged gently at strands, testing their strength before handing over coins or exchanging them for apricots or onions. It was not uncommon for barter to cross generations. A grandmother selling yarn might take payment not in money, but in food for her household, trusting her family's socks and scarves would be sold later, nearby. Herbal sellers offered remedies in small cloth packets. Their stalls smelled sharply of mint, sage, and dried fennel. A cracked voice might describe which herb soothed stomachaches, which leaf cured coughs, and which powder warded off fevers. Some remedies were local, drawn from the surrounding steppe and mountain slopes. Others had traveled farther, small quantities of cinnamon or cardamom carried from India, mixed into local blends. These sellers were not physicians in the learned sense, but they were practical healers of daily life, consulted as often as the village midwife. The textile corner of the market hummed with activity. Weavers displayed bolts of coarse cloth made from sheep's wool or hemp. Unlike the glossy silks that came from the East, these fabrics were meant for work clothes, cloaks, and tents. Merchants bought them in bulk, knowing their caravans would wear garments thin on long journeys. Tailors sat cross-legged on raised platforms, scissors in hand, ready to cut cloth into tunics or trousers. Needles and thread might be sold separately, but here the whole process of making clothes unfolded in plain view. At another stall, cobblers repaired sandals and boots. Leather, stiff from desert winds, needed constant mending. A traveler's boot was as important as his horse. Without it, he could not walk the roads. The cobblers used awls to pierce holes, then stitched with waxed cord. They sold simple shoes to flat-soled, wrapped in leather, sometimes with felt linings for cold weather. Socks from one stall and boots from another formed a quiet partnership, ensuring that journeys continued without frostbite or blisters, and always there was food. A man roasted chickpeas over a clay stove, the warm, nutty smell drifting through the air. Children tugged at parents' sleeves for a handful of them, wrapped in paper. Women bought lentils and beans, measured by cupfuls, not sackfuls. Dates, raisins, and figs from farther west appeared in small baskets, eaten as sweets or stored for journeys. The dried fruits glittered like jewels in the dusty market light, yet they were not luxury, simply necessary calories in compact form. Kashgar's market also served as a place for exchange of news and stories, a form of trade no less important than goods. Merchants from Persia told of distant wars. Travelers from India spoke of holy sites. Chinese officials repeated edicts issued months earlier in Chang'an. Gatherings formed around storytellers who recited tales, half history and half fable, often in sing-song rhythm. These stories were as much part of the market as socks and spices. They stitched the far ends of the Silk Road into a fabric of shared imagination, even if accuracy frayed along the edges. But the market was not constant. It swelled and shrank with the seasons. In harvest months, stalls overflowed with grain, melons, and fresh herbs. In winter, trade slowed. Goods shrank to dried roots, wool, and preserved food. Snow narrowed the streets, and fewer caravans risked the passes. Yet even then, the market never ceased. Someone always needed a needle replaced, a boot patched, a handful of salt purchased. Life's small requirements ignored the calendar. Religion, too, shaped the marketplace. On Fridays, the market slowed round the central mosque as worshippers gathered for prayer. Certain stalls sold candles, incense, and paper charms for religious use. Monks passing through might barter for supplies, leaving behind small offerings of blessings. Faith did not dominate the market, but it threaded quietly through its rhythms, reminding all who traded there of life beyond material needs. The overlooked details were often the most enduring. Consider the soapmaker who boiled fats with ash to create rough blocks of cleanser. Sold cheaply, these soaps traveled with families to riversides for washing, keeping clothes usable longer. Or the rope maker, twisting hemp fibers into cords that tied loads to camels, drew water from wells, or lashed roofs against desert winds. These trades did not enrich empires, but they supported the survival of households and caravans alike. And yet, for all its ordinariness, Kashgar's market was never entirely isolated. Foreign coins mingled with local ones. A Roman denarius might pass through one hand and then vanish into another. Its image of a distant emperor long irrelevant, but its silver still valued. Chinese bronze coins clinked against Central Asian copper pieces in purses. Each carried the marks of distant governments. Yet here in Kashgar, they were simply tokens for bread, socks, or salt. It is tempting to dismiss such small trades as trivial compared to the caravans of silk and porcelain. But without them, the caravans would never move. Needles kept garments mended. Woolen socks prevented frostbite. Soap allowed health on long journeys. Rope bound loads securely. In the hierarchy of goods, it was not silk that ensured survival, but these humble items. So as you walk through Kashgar's market in your imagination, pause not at the rare luxuries, but but at the stall where a woman sells socks, or where a man offers simple herbs. It is here, in the unnoticed corners, that the Silk Road was most alive, and perhaps we must ask, if we judge the Silk Road only by its luxuries, do we miss the truer story, the steady persistence of ordinary people, selling what they could, buying what they needed, weaving survival into the fabric of trade? By now you can picture Kashgar's marketplace, shaded alleys of mud brick, reed mats swaying overhead, the steady hum of bargaining voices, woolen socks stacked neatly beside piles of dried apricots. But to truly understand its significance, you must step back and see how such an unassuming place held the Silk Road together. Caravans did not live on silk or jade alone. A string of camels could carry bolts of cloth across deserts, but the men guiding them needed food, tools, and warmth. The caravan master, counting his profit in precious goods, still relied on rope, needles, soap, and sturdy footwear. Without socks and salted cheese, without spices to disguise the monotony of barley stews, without herbal powders for stomach illness, the caravans could stall before reaching their destinations. In this way, Kashgar's quiet trade underpinned the grander visions of empire. Kashgar stood at a crossroads of routes. To the east lay the deserts of the Tarim Basin, dotted with other oases, but demanding careful planning. To the west stretched mountain passes toward Samarkand and Persia. To the south, routes led into India through treacherous terrain. Every caravan stopping in Kashgar recalibrated here, stocking up on flour, dried fruit, wool, and simple necessities before moving onward. The market was less a place of luxury than a way station for survival. Consider, for a moment, the woolen sock. Coarse, perhaps itchy, not much to look at. Yet a pair could mean the difference between frostbite and safe passage across a snowy pass. Travelers carried pairs not as souvenirs, but as insurance against the cold. When a merchant returned home to far-off lands, perhaps his silk bolts would be displayed in a noble hall, but the socks, worn and patched, had already served their purpose silently along the way. Or think of the humble needle. An entire tent ripped by desert winds could be rendered useless without repair. A coat torn in the cold might mean exposure, sickness, even death. A single iron needle, purchased in Kashgar, extended the lifespan of garments, of saddlebags, of canvas. Small as they were, these objects were anchors of survival. No caravan inventory list would boast of them, yet they were the glue that held travel together. Food told the same story. Apricots dried in Kashgar found their way into the pockets of travelers, chewed slowly during long rides. Bread baked in clay ovens was bought by the dozen, consumed before spoiling. Yogurt and cheese carried in clay jars lasted days into journeys. Without these provisions, even the grandest merchant would not make it across the wastes. The quiet trades also shaped the lives of Kashgar's residents. A family who sold socks might never leave the oasis, but their work wrapped the feet of travelers who would. The herbalist who measured fennel seeds might never see Samarkand, yet his remedies traveled in a pouch to far-off lands. In this sense, Kashgar's market was a bridge not by producing wealth directly, but by providing the means for wealth to move safely across space. For the local people, this exchange also meant survival. Farmers could sell surplus barley in the market and use the proceeds to buy salt or needles. Shepherds exchanged cheese for thread. Women spun yarn, dyed it, and saw it converted into food for their families. In a world without supermarkets or warehouses, the market was the living heart of daily life. And yet, despite its ordinariness, echoes of Kashgar's market reached beyond its dusty streets. Archaeological finds in Central Asia reveal fragments of cloth that might have been woven near Kashgar. Ancient coins from Rome and Byzantium, found in the region, testify to the mingling of currencies across thousands of miles. Even in these small trades, the fingerprints of distant worlds appeared. Still, what made Kashgar unique was not grandeur but persistence. Week after week, season after season, through floods and droughts, the market continued. Generations of children grew up running errands through its stalls, learning the art of bargaining, measuring flour by hand, and valuing the usefulness of a needle more than the glitter of distant luxuries. The steady rhythm of socks, spices, and soap endured long after kingdoms rose and fell. When historians speak of the Silk Road, they often emphasize the spectacular, jeweled treasures. Imperial envoys, religious texts carried across deserts. But perhaps the truer story is this quieter one. The Silk Road could not have functioned without Kashgar's small market. Its survival was woven from these humdrum exchanges. The luxuries dazzled courts, but the ordinary goods kept people alive long enough to deliver them. And perhaps this leaves us with a question worth considering. In the vast sweep of history, is it the extraordinary that sustains the ordinary, or is it, more often, the ordinary that sustains the extraordinary? Kashgar's market whispers its answer softly through woolen socks and simple needles. When you imagine the Silk Road, you may picture silk bolts, porcelain, or horses. Yet among the quietest and most enduring travelers of that long route was tea, not the delicate porcelain teacups of an emperor's palace, nor the finely powdered whisked tea of elite ceremonies, but the rough, practical tea of the road. In the Song dynasty, when tea drinking was already a well-rooted custom in China, tea became both a commodity and a comforta drink that sustained merchants, soothed weary travelers, and made its way slowly into the cups of faraway lands by the 10th and 11th centuries. Tea was no longer a novelty in China. It was a daily habit woven into social life and ritual. Farmers cultivated tea shrubs in southern provinces, plucking tender leaves and steaming them to preserve their freshness. But for the road, tea was prepared differently, pressed into dense tea bricks. These were blocks of compressed leaves, easy to pack, light to carry, and resistant to spoilage. A merchant could strap several bricks to a mule, knowing they would last through weeks of travel along the dusty road from Chang'an westward. Tea was less about refinement than resilience. A brick could be shaved with a knife, the shavings boiled in a kettle with water from a stream, sometimes salted, sometimes flavored with dried ginger. The result was not the delicate green clarity prized at court, but a dark, steaming drink that warmed the body and settled the stomach. For merchants trudging through cold passes or desert winds, it was as necessary as bread or soup. Picture a caravan halting after a day's march. Camels groan as loads are lowered. Fires are lit in shallow pits, fed with twigs and dung. A small iron pot is set over the flames. Into the pot go water and tea shavings. The liquid darkens, a bitter aroma rising. Cups, sometimes porcelain, more often wooden or clay bowls are passed around. Hands warm against the steam, weary faces relax. In that moment, the tea is more than a drink. It is a pause, a shared ritual that bridges fatigue. The Song dynasty did not invent this habit, but it carried it to new scales. As China's population swelled and trade expanded, tea moved outward in larger volumes. Some traveled overland through the Silk Road, more traveled by sea, carried by ships to ports in Southeast Asia. But in Kashgar, Samarkand, or Dunhuang, merchants remembered tea not as luxury porcelain, but as a dependable comfort from the East. For officials along the way, tea also carried symbolic weight. In frontier posts, garrisons received tea as part of their rations, sent from the central government. It was a sign of connection to the empire's core. Soldiers drank it not as ceremony, but as sustenance. Tea kept them alert on long watches and warmed them in winter barracks. Some frontier officers wrote in their reports that without tea, discipline slackened. With it, men bore the cold better. The road also transformed tea itself. When traded into Central Asia, it was often boiled with milk, salt, or butter, blending with the habits of nomadic peoples. Tibetan herders churned tea with yak butter, creating a calorie-rich drink that suited their high-altitude lives. Merchants crossing the Pamir Mountains often adopted the same style, finding its fat and salt more sustaining than plain infusion. Thus, the tea that left the Song heartland did not remain purely Chinese. It adapted, changed, absorbed the tastes of new environments. But what made tea valuable was not only its flavor. It was light to carry compared to other foods, compact in brick form, and durable against spoilage. A merchant might hesitate to pack fresh vegetables or fragile jars, but he never hesitated to pack tea. In barter, tea bricks became a form of currency. A caravan might trade tea for horses, wool, or medicine. In some regions, bricks were stamped with official marks, showing their weight and origin, much like coins. Though not as universal as silver, they circulated as trusted tokens of value. Within China itself, tea culture blossomed in refinement under the Song, with scholars writing poems about its preparation and painters depicting delicate gatherings around kettles. But for the Silk Road merchant, all this refinement shrank into something practical, a steaming bowl under the stars, far from home. The merchant may never write poetry, yet the tea gave him the same sense of pause, of being briefly anchored in a drifting world. We must remember, too, that tea was more than a stimulant. It was believed to balance the humors, to aid digestion, to clear the head. Buddhist monks, traveling with caravans, drank tea to sustain long hours of meditation. Muslim traders adopted it in their own ways, appreciating its warmth on cold journeys. In this way, tea crossed not only mountains, but also cultures of belief. And so, in the quiet pauses of the Silk Road, tea was present, bitter, steaming, held in rough cups, passed hand to hand. It did not dazzle with color or rarity. It simply endured, sip by sip, keeping travelers steady on their path. And here is the thought we end this section with. In a world that remembers the Silk Road for silks and gold. Should we not also remember it for the simple tea, brick humble, bitter, sustaining that traveled farther than most treasures ever could? If the road was the spine of Silk Road travel, then the inns and tea-houses along its length were the bones and joints, small but vital places where movement paused and lives briefly touched. For weary travelers of the Song dynasty, tea was not only brewed over campfires in the open air, but also served in wooden halls, dusty courtyards, and bustling roadside stalls where the smell of boiling leaves mingled with the smoke of roasting meat and the chatter of many tongues. The Song dynasty witnessed a flowering of tea-house culture in China. In cities like Kaifeng or Hangzhou, tea-houses stood on street corners, decorated with bamboo screens, painted signs, and rows of tea bowls stacked neatly on shelves. There, local residents gathered for gossip, music, or theater. But the same spirit extended outward to the highways and post stations that connected the empire. On the great road westward, the tea-house was simpler. Sometimes it was no more than a wooden hut with a bench and a clay stove. Sometimes it was a bustling roadside inn where a dozen caravans might stop in a single evening. Yet, whether large or small, the heart of the establishment was the same. A kettle kept warm, ready to pour tea for whoever stepped through the door. For the traveler who had been staring at the endless road, a tea-house offered not only drink but recognition. Someone would nod, ask about the road ahead, or share a tale of a bandit sighting. Tea was the excuse to sit, to rest, to listen. The cups themselves, varied crude bowls, cracked porcelain, occasionally fine where that had made its way westward. But in each, the same bitter liquid offered the same relief. Beyond the tea-houses were the larger inns, where caravans lodged overnight. Picture a square courtyard, surrounded by low rooms, gates creaking open as camels filed in, their loads of silk, porcelain, or wool stacked in heaps. Fires sprang up in corners, pots bubbled, and through it all, kettles of tea steamed constantly. For merchants, the first task was often to secure water. Good water, drawn from wells or rivers, was prized, for it determined the taste of the tea. Many inns became famous for their water, as much as their tea itself. Travelers, passing down advice such as, "At Pingliang, the well water makes a clear cup. At Dunhuang, the river is too bitter by water from the north." Well, once brewed, the tea did more than quench thirst. It created conversation. In the courtyard of an inn, merchants who had never met before might exchange news over bowls of steaming tea. A man from Sichuan spoke of the quality of the year's pepper harvest. Another from Samarkand described the rising price of horses. Maps were drawn in the dust with chopsticks. Agreements were sealed with nods. Tea was the medium of trust. The road was long, the nights often restless. In tea-houses and inns, tea became part of storytelling. A host might recite a tale of ancient kings while refilling bowls. A monk, traveling with scripture, might pause to speak of karmic lessons while sipping tea. Merchants from foreign lands sometimes told stories of their distant cities. Baghdad, Samarkand, Constantinople, while Chinese traders listened. Cups warming their hands, tea sharpened the tongue, cleared the head, and kept listeners alert. Unlike wine, which dulled the senses, tea stretched out the night, allowing words to flow. Some inns even hired storytellers, men who could recite sagas for hours, their fee paid in bowls of tea. In this way, the leaves of southern China carried not just warmth, but also the rhythm of narrative, weaving strangers into a temporary community. Not every encounter was so grand. Often, tea was sold in the humblest stalls, a table under a tree, a kettle hanging over embers, a woman ladling steaming liquid into bowls for a few copper coins. For those too poor to afford an inn, such stalls were life-saving. Travelers recalled the sight of steam rising from a roadside pot as a beacon of comfort. One record tells of a scholar traveling westward who, upon seeing such a stall after days of bitter cold, described the first swallow of hot tea as like fire reaching the marrow. It was not elegance, he remembered, but necessity. Without that bowl, he might have collapsed before reaching the next town. What made these tea spaces remarkable was not their architecture or refinement, but their role as meeting grounds. On a single bench, a Confucian scholar, a Buddhist monk, a Persian trader, and a Turkic herder might sit side by side, steam rising from their bowls. Each spoke a different tongue, each held different beliefs, yet all shared the same sip. The tea itself adapted to these encounters. In some stalls, Chinese merchants drank it plain, while their Central Asian companions stirred in butter or salt. Hosts learned to accommodate both, preparing kettles of different kinds. In this small way, tea revealed its flexibility, its ability to bridge difference. For many who traveled the Silk Road, memories of tea lingered longer than those of goods or hardships. A merchant might forget the exact price of silk or the weight of a horse, but he would remember the warmth of a bowl shared with strangers on a cold night. Even when they returned home, far from China, travelers sometimes spoke of tea as the taste of the road itself, bitter, sustaining, and communal. And so, in inns and tea-houses, courtyards, and roadside stalls, tea was not only brewed, but also lived. It carried news, sealed friendships, and gave weary bodies a moment's reprieve. On the road, tea was more than a drink, it was a kind of language, spoken without words, understood by all who paused to sip. By the time a merchant left the heartlands of China and pressed onward into the highlands and deserts, tea itself was on the move. What began as powdered leaves whisked in bowls in the Song capital did not remain unchanged. Instead, like the caravans themselves, tea adapted to each landscape, each culture, each set of hands that prepared it. Climbing the mountain passes into Tibet, merchants encountered a new kind of tea. Here, the air was thin, the winds biting, and the diet rich in butter, barley, and meat. Plain tea, light and fragrant, offered little sustenance in such conditions. So, Tibetans reshaped it. Leaves boiled into a dark brew, churned with yak, butter, and salt, then poured into wooden cups. This was not the refined whisking of song scholars. It was heavy, nourishing, almost a meal in itself. The butter added calories, the salt replenished minerals lost to sweat and exertion, the warmth shielded against cold. For Tibetans, tea was not luxury but survival. Merchants who sipped it for the first time often described shock at its thickness, but, for those who lingered, its comfort became undeniable. Butter tea also changed the rhythm of trade. Tea leaves from China were pressed into dense bricks for transport, easier to carry over rugged passes. These bricks were currency in Tibet, traded for horses, wool, or medicinal herbs. A caravan might measure its fortune not in silver but in stacks of compressed tea. Thus, the humble leaf became both drink and money, binding regions together in networks of exchange. Further west, on the open steppe, tea continued its transformations. Among Turkic and Mongol peoples, it was often boiled with milk rather than butter, flavored with salt or even meat broth. For nomads living on horseback, tea blended seamlessly into diets already centered on dairy. It became both drink and supplement, restoring energy during long rides. Accounts tell of Mongol warriors carrying pouches of tea alongside dried curds, brewing it in iron pots slung over fires. For them, tea was not exotic, it was practical. Its bitterness cut through fatty meals, its warmth eased cold nights, and like Tibetans, they valued tea bricks as currency. A well-packed load of tea could be exchanged across vast distances for horses, hides, or weapons. In the markets of Samarkand and Bukhara, tea began to appear alongside spices and silks. Merchants from Persia learned its bitterness, sometimes sweetening it with sugar or blending it with herbs. Slowly, tea began to weave itself into the cultural fabric of lands far from its Chinese roots. By the later centuries, tea began touching the Islamic world, though slowly and cautiously. Coffee would later dominate these lands, but early mentions of tea suggest curiosity at its properties. A drink that refreshed without intoxication, sharpened the mind without clouding it. For Sufi mystics and scholars, such qualities were intriguing. While coffee would eventually take pride of place, tea carved out a quiet presence, especially in border markets, where merchants carried both leaves and stories from the East Persian poetry of the time. Rarely mentioned tea, yet it whispered of gatherings where warm drinks sustained conversation, whether they were of coffee or the unfamiliar leaves from Cathay. The idea of a communal bowl passed between friends resonated with traditions of hospitality deeply rooted in Persian culture. What is striking is how tea did not remain fixed. Each land reshaped it, much as travelers reshaped themselves along the road. To the song scholar, tea was art, powdered, whisked, admired for its foam and fragrance. To the Tibetan shepherd, it was butter and salt, strength against the cold. To the steppe rider, it was milk and sustenance. To the Persian trader, it was curiosity, a foreign warmth at the edge of the familiar. And yet, in all these forms, tea carried the same essence. The leaf of Camellia plucked in southern China, dried and packed for the road. Across mountains and deserts, its bitterness endured, uniting those who drank it in ways words could not. Today, when you sip a cup of tea, whether it is green leaves in a porcelain pot, black leaves steeped in milk, or butter tea churned in the highlands, you are tasting echoes of these journeys. Each recipe, each preparation is a record of adaptation, proof that the road changed not only goods but habits, not only economies but daily rituals. Imagine, then, a weary merchant of the Song dynasty. He departs from a roadside tea house with a pouch of leaves tucked into his pack. Weeks later, he sips butter tea in Tibet. Months later, he drinks milk tea on the steppe. Years later, he may hear whispers of its arrival in distant markets. He carries no single tea tradition, but a collection of memories stitched together by steam and bitterness. This was the legacy of tea on the Silk Road. It was never one drink, one ritual, one culture. It was many, and in that multiplicity lies its quiet power in the end. Perhaps the question is not how tea changed as it traveled, but how those who drank it changed with it. Did the song scholar, sipping butter tea for the first time, see Tibet differently? Did the Mongol rider, tasting whisked tea in a Chinese city, carry home a new curiosity? Did the Persian merchant, encountering the bitter leaf, imagine possibilities beyond his own customs? The road was long, the merchants weary. Yet steaming cups of tea, whether whisked, churned, or boiled, reminded them that survival and connection were never built on silk alone. The Taklamakan Desert stretches like an ocean of sand across western China. Its name, whispered by travelers, carried a warning: go in, and you may not come out. Endless dunes, shifting winds, and the absence of water made it one of the most feared regions on the Silk Road. Woven through its edges, faint tracks and caravan routes persisted, threading from oasis to oasis, to guide, protect, and sometimes warn those who ventured into this perilous expanse. Watchtowers were raised, lonely sentinels of mud brick and timber, standing against time and sand. To understand why these towers existed, picture the geography. The Silk Road skirted the edges of the Taklamakan, hugging the oasis towns that dotted its northern and southern rims. These towns, places like Naya Lulan and Khotans, survived only because of rivers that spilled out from the mountains, creating narrow green lifelines before fading into desert. Between them stretched days of sand and emptiness. For merchants and pilgrims, getting lost meant death. Winds erased tracks within hours, and the landscape offered no landmarks beyond the dunes. Here, watchtowers provided crucial orientation. Rising higher than the surrounding desert, they served as fixed points on the horizon. A rider, spotting the faint shape of a tower, knew that human life and often water was not impossibly far. The towers themselves were practical, not grand, built of stamped earth, mud brick, or timber where available. They rose in simple rectangular forms. Some stood only a few meters tall. Others reached higher, with staircases or ladders leading to upper platforms. Their size varied with resources, but their purpose was the same: to watch, to signal, to endure. Wooden beams, often carried from distant mountains, were inserted into the walls to stabilize them. In some ruins uncovered today, you can still see the ends of these beams protruding, though worn by centuries of wind. At the tops of towers, platforms were built where guards could look out, scanning the desert for travelers, caravans, or threats. Imagine, for a moment, the man stationed there. He was not a soldier of glory, not a commander of armies. More often, he was a conscript or a local man hired for his endurance. His duty was to climb the tower each morning, survey the horizon, and light signals when necessary. Days passed slowly. The desert around him shifted. The sun burned overhead. The silence pressed in. He might spend hours mending his sandals, boiling millet porridge, or oiling a bowstring. A small garrison might share the tower, cooking together in clay pots, telling stories by lamplight. Supplies came irregularly, often carried on donkeys from the nearest oasis. Water was rationed carefully. Letters, when they came, brought brief news of homewives' fields, children growing up unseen. The guard's main tool was fire. At night, he might ignite bundles of reeds soaked in oil, sending a column of flame into the sky. By day, he burned dry grass to make thick smoke. These signals could warn of bandits, announce an approaching caravan, or call for aid. Other towers, strung across the desert, repeated the message like echoes until it reached an outpost or town. Archaeologists exploring the Taklamakan have found traces of these forgotten lives. In collapsed towers, they discovered firewood stored in niches, clay lamps, fragments of arrows, and even wooden tablets with official messages written in early Chinese scripts. Some towers yielded scraps of cloths, part of a uniform, perhaps a personal garment patched too many times. At one site near the ruins of Lullabies, a tower contained a stash of millet grains, remarkably preserved by the dryness. Another revealed bones of goats, suggesting that the garrison sometimes kept livestock nearby, though grazing was scarce. Each fragment, though ordinary, tells of the men who endured in these posts, waiting for travelers who might never come. To a weary caravan master, these towers meant safety. They reassured him that the empire had not forgotten this road, that the track was still guarded, still alive. A merchant could rest near the base, refill water, or ask the guards about conditions ahead. Sometimes, guards escorted groups across the most dangerous stretches, offering guidance for a small fee or imperial order. But the towers were more than practical. They were psychological anchors. In a desert where the horizon could feel infinite and crushing, the sight of human construction square, solid, defiant against the sand reminded travelers that civilization was not entirely absent, and yet, for the guards themselves, glory was scarce. Their names are mostly lost. They stood in the desert for months or years, unseen by history, their bones likely buried in shallow graves near their posts. When an empire collapsed or withdrew, the towers were abandoned. Sand crept in, beams cracked, bricks crumbled. Still, some fragments remain, silent against the dunes, testifying to those who once stood watch. The desert watchtowers raise a quiet question in history. Do we remember only the merchants and emperors, or do we also remember the men who kept the paths safe for them? Without the guards, would the Silk Road have endured at all, or would its roots have vanished under sand and fear? If the watchtower stood alone, it was a lonely monument. But in truth, no tower was ever truly solitary. Each belonged to a chain, a network of structures that stretched for miles along the Silk Road. Together they formed the skeleton of imperial presence in the desert, thin, fragile perhaps, but crucial for projecting power and sustaining the roots that bound China to the wider world. The earliest systematic use of watchtowers in the Taklamakan's orbit dates to the Han dynasty, particularly during the reign of Emperor Wu 141 to 87 BCE. It was under his rule that the empire pushed westward, determined to secure access to the oases and to the exotic goods flowing from Central Asia. The Han did not simply conquer towns and leave them. They built infrastructure. Forts, beacon towers, and garrisons were planted like stepping stones across the desert's edge. The Great Wall, stretching thousands of miles to the east, did not stop at fertile plains. It sprouted outposts that extended into the Tarim Basin. These towers were cousins of that system. adapted to harsher landscapes. Some were placed near rivers or wells. Others were perched on ridges where their signals could travel farthest. Distances were calculated carefully so that the smoke of one tower could be seen from the next, forming a chain of warnings across the sand. In times of war, messages could travel hundreds of kilometers in a single day through such relays, speed unmatched by any single horseman. Centuries later, under the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, the towers took on new life. The Tang court saw itself as a cosmopolitan hub, eager to sustain Silk Road exchanges of silk, horses, and ideas. Protecting the western routes was essential. And once again, watchtowers became tools of security. The Temps combined them with postal stations, known as yijian. Along these routes, riders could exchange exhausted horses for fresh ones, carrying letters or imperial edicts. Many stations had adjacent towers, their signals alerting both soldiers and couriers. The system created not just safety, but communication, news of rebellions, the arrival of caravans, or shifts in frontier politics could reach the capital far faster than without them. The Temps were also aware that the desert swallowed memory quickly. To assert authority, they rebuilt towers regularly, keeping them visible markers of imperial reach. The tower was not only a practical beacon, it was a statement, reminding both merchants and local rulers that the empire's eye was watching. Beyond empire, the towers had a civilian role. Caravans depended on them as reference points, much like travelers today depend on roadside signs or lighthouses. Maps of the period often listed towers as waypoints, and some caravan diaries described journeys not in distances but in terms of towers passed. From the Tower of the Three Wells to the Tower of the Broken Beam, merchants sometimes left messages or offerings at these posts. A slip of bamboo, scratched with characters, might record the safe passage of a caravan. A small pouch of grain might be left as thanks for shelter. In this way, the towers became part of the social memory of the road, repositories of small acts and silent communications. While we imagine the Silk Road as a peaceful trade route, the frontier was often dangerous. Bandits, raiding nomads, and rival armies stalked the oases. Towers were the first line of defense. When raiders approached, the guards' fire alerted nearby forts. Troops could be dispatched quickly, sometimes deterring attacks before they began. In some cases, towers themselves were garrisoned with archers, or equipped with simple fortifications, ditches, wooden palisades, or spiked barriers. But their strength lay less in fighting than in forewarning. A caravan ambushed in the open might vanish without a trace, but a caravan traveling near the line of towers could hope for protection. This made the routes safer and encouraged more merchants to risk the crossing. Modern archaeology reveals how connected the towers were. Excavations have found documents describing the assignment of guards, lists of supplies, even complaints about shortages of oil or grain. One surviving wooden slip from the Han-era records, the delivery of 300 arrows to a particular tower, evidence that the empire invested in these outposts. However distant, other slips mention repairs, walls patched after storms, ladders replaced, roofs thatched anew. Empires knew that neglecting a single tower could unravel the chain, leaving gaps in the network. So resources trickled out, carried on camelback to sustain even the most isolated posts, and yet the life of the towers was fragile. When dynasties weakened, funds and manpower dwindled, guards deserted, posts crumbled, caravans sought other routes. During the centuries of fragmentation between the Han and Tang, many towers fell silent. The desert advanced, swallowing them whole. Later dynasties revived some, abandoned others, but the principle endured. To control the desert, one did not need to patrol every dune. One needed a line of towers, modest yet resilient, to anchor the roots. Thus the desert watchtowers were not just lonely shelters, but parts of vast systems, threads binding soldiers, merchants, and empires across the Taklamakan's edge. Each tower was both small and essential, one stone in a wall of invisible defense that allowed trade to endure. But this leaves us with an unresolved thought. What happened when those systems faltered? When towers fell into ruin and the road no longer held its guardians? Did the desert reclaim its silence completely, or did traces of human presence linger, shaping memory long after the towers themselves were gone? When an empire withdrew, the desert wasted no time in reclaiming what had been built. The watchtowers of the Taklamakan, once strung like beads along the trade routes, began to crumble. Bricks softened in rare rains, beams splintered, roofs collapsed. Sand piled against their sides, swallowing stairways and doorways. Slowly, the towers that had once defined the edge of empire became indistinguishable from the dunes themselves. The silence, after the guards for the men who had once climbed their ladders and lit their fires. There was no grand farewell. Most likely, abandonment came gradually. Supplies stopped arriving. Orders ceased. Guards were reassigned to more urgent fronts, or simply left to return home. A tower left with only 1 or 2 men could not survive long. Fires would burn less often than not at all. Travelers passing through would have noticed the difference. A merchant, seeing no signal from a tower, might press on nervously, knowing the route was less safe. Over time, whole stretches of the desert became unmarked again, and caravans sought safer paths. The once living chain of towers fell silent, one post after another, until only ruins remained. Forgotten by maps as dynasties rose and fell, the memory of these towers faded. Later maps sometimes marked only the oases, not the outposts in between. Songs and poems that once celebrated the frontier garrisons grew rare. By the time of the Yuan and Ming dynasties, many of the towers had been forgotten altogether, their remains buried beneath the dunes, and yet the desert preserved them. Unlike wetter climates, where wood and brick decay quickly, the Taklamakan's dryness kept beams, grains, and even scraps of writing intact. What was abandoned to silence was not lost entirely. It was simply waiting. Rediscovery in the modern Aegean, the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Explorers and archaeologists began to probe the Taklamakan. Among the most famous was Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-British archaeologist who trekked across Central Asia, braving sandstorms and bitter cold. Guided by local knowledge, Stein and others stumbled upon the remains of ancient towers. To their astonishment, they found not just collapsed walls, but artifacts of daily life. Clay ceilings, fragments of wooden tablets, arrowheads, scraps of cloth, even children's toys surfaced from the sand. In some towers, wooden documents still bore clear Chinese characters, recording rations, duty rosters, and mundane messages. The silence of the desert had safeguarded the voices of long-forgotten guards. Stein described how lonely these ruins felt. Piles of earth rising out of endless dunes, beams jutting like broken bones, the air heavy with stillness, and yet in each ruin there was evidence of human hands, the pattern of bricks, the angle of stairways, the faint traces of fire in a hearth. What the towers tell us from these remains. A picture emerges not of grand history, but of ordinary endurance. The men in the towers were not emperors, generals, or great merchants. They were conscripts, local farmers, and soldiers whose lives left only faint traces. And yet, without them, the Silk Road would have been far more perilous. The towers reveal a paradox of history. They were small structures, often crude and temporary, yet their impact was vast. They anchored routes that linked China to Persia, India, and beyond. They provided safety, orientation, and communication. They turned the inhospitable edge of the Taklamakan into a space that could be crossed. Lessons in fragility, but their ruins also speak of fragility. Empires believed they could impose order on the desert, but the towers show how tenuous that control was. A few missed supply deliveries, a few unlit fires, and the chain unraveled. The desert did not need to conquer with armies, it simply waited. The silence of abandoned towers raises a broader reflection. How much of human effort, no matter how determined, eventually yields to the landscapes around it? How many walls, fortresses, or outposts across the world now lie buried, their guardians forgotten? The modern echo today, some of the ruins still stand, visited by archaeologists, travelers, and the occasional camel caravan retracing old routes. They are no longer guardians, no longer alive with smoke and signal fires, but their presence lingers. For those who see them, they evoke both admiration and melancholy. Admiration for the endurance of the men who once kept watch, melancholy for the inevitability of their erasure. Standing before one of these ruins, you might imagine the guard climbing to the platform centuries ago, squinting at the horizon. Did he feel pride in serving the empire, or simply boredom and fatigue? Did he imagine that his tower would last forever, or did he already sense how quickly the desert would take it back? In the end, the watchtowers of the Taklamakan remind us that history is often carried not by the powerful, but by the ordinary. Their bricks and beams whisper of men whose names are lost, but whose work shaped the survival of countless caravans. They remind us that safety and communication, those quiet foundations of travel, mattered as much as silk or spices. Perhaps the final question left by these ruins is this: when future generations sift through the remains of our own infrastructure, what will they think of the towers we built, tower roads, our posts, our signals, and how quickly the desert of time reclaimed them? If you picture the Silk Road, your mind may turn first to camel caravans threading through deserts, or to bales of silk laid out in dazzling market stalls. You may imagine spices heaped in bowls, or gleaming coins clinking into purses. But the daily reality of trade along these routes rested on something far less glamorous: the scales. For in Antioch, in Aleppo, and in the many towns and caravanserais between, no bale of wool, no sack of pepper, No jar of oil changed hands without first being weighed. Antioch and Aleppo, gateways of Antioch, seated on the Orontes River, had long been a city of crossroads. Founded in the Hellenistic era and later absorbed into the Byzantine and then Islamic worlds, it connected the Mediterranean to inland Syria. Aleppo, a few days' journey to the east, became one of the region's great inland emporia. By the medieval period, Aleppo's markets attracted caravans from Persia, Armenia, Arabia, and beyond. The road between Antioch and Aleppo was not especially long, but it was essential, carrying both goods and the systems of measurement that governed their exchange. Traders who moved along this route had to concern themselves not only with the dangers of travel ban, storms, or political conflict, but also with the smaller but no less significant risk of unfair trade. A single dishonest scale could erase the profits of a week's journey. Thus, the weighing of goods became one of the most important, if least celebrated, aspects of the Silk Road's operation. The implements of trust, the tools themselves, were simple. The beam balance, a device whose design had changed little since ancient Egypt, was the most common. Suspended from a central pivot, it allowed two trays or pans to be compared, one holding the goods, the other holding standardized weights. For larger cargoes, steelyards were used, long beams with sliding weights that could measure heavier loads. Weights were themselves objects of scrutiny and regulation. Small lumps of bronze or iron, sometimes inscribed with official marks, were meant to guarantee consistency. In practice, however, they varied. Cities like Aleppo employed market inspectors who carried their own reference weights, checking that merchants were not shaving metal off their standards or producing false measures. Records from Byzantine and later Islamic legal texts reveal long debates about what constituted fair weight and fair measure, proof that disputes were common for the caravan merchant. Arriving from afar, the first stop was often not the stall itself, but the weigh station. Here, goods would be placed on scales under the watch of officials. Fees might be levied for the service, adding yet another small cost to the long chain of expenses. The boring ritual of markets. So imagine the marketplace in Aleppo in the 12th or 13th century. Stalls are crowded with goods, dried figs, indigo, glassware, woolens, carpets, and blocks of soap for which the city was famous. Merchants haggle over prices, but behind every transaction lies the same monotonous ritual. A sack of peppercorns is hoisted onto the scales. The official set of weights is brought out, one by one, and compared. Perhaps the scale tips, and a small handful is removed to balance it. Only once balance is achieved can the deal proceed. For the casual observer, this might seem unbearably slow. But for the traders, it was as necessary as locking a chest or posting a guard at night. A caravan master who had paid for 40 measures of dye needed to know that he was receiving 40 and not 38. Without the trust created by weighing, long-distance trade would have collapsed under suspicion. Weighing as a form of power weighing was never neutral. Control of the scales often meant control of the trade. City officials who oversaw markets could extract fees, impose penalties, or simply tip the balance in favor of local merchants. In Antioch, Byzantine administrators were known to regulate market weights carefully, publishing decrees against fraud. Later, under Islamic rule, the mutasibla market inspector took on this role, ensuring not only fairness but also moral order in the marketplace. Merchants themselves sometimes resisted. Accounts survive of traders carrying their own sets of weights, insisting on using them in deals. Others might try to bribe inspectors, hoping for favorable treatment. Thus, every act of weighing was a negotiation not only of goods, but of authority, the human side of the scales behind. All this were the ordinary workers who spent their days at the scales. Consider the porter in Antioch, lifting sacks onto the balance day after day, his back aching from the effort. Consider the inspector, squinting at the beam to see if it truly balanced. Consider the merchant, waiting impatiently as each weight was brought out, knowing that his profit or loss depended on the outcome. None of these tasks was dramatic. No chronicles recorded them, no poems celebrated them. And yet, without them, the caravans would have faltered. It is in these overlooked labors that the Silk Road was truly sustained. A question of universality, one might ask. How universal were these weights? A merchant arriving from Egypt might be used to different measures than one from Persia. In fact, weights varied widely. One city's pound might not match another's. Thus, conversion tables often memorized by experienced traders became essential. The road from Antioch to Aleppo was not just lined with stones and inns, but also with invisible systems of equivalence, constantly negotiated. And so we arrive at a question. In a world where weights differed from city to city, where inspectors could be strict or corrupt, and where merchants had to carry not only their goods but also their trust, how did the Silk Road continue to function at all? Was the system of weighing robust enough to hold trade together, or was it forever at the edge of collapse, saved only by the patience of those who endured its rituals? The road between Antioch and Aleppo was short compared to the long caravan routes across deserts or mountains. But in that short distance, the act of weighing goods multiplied into many layers of authority, profit, and bureaucracy. Scales were not only instruments of fairness, they were instruments of power. To understand their significance, you must step into the monotonous world of toll houses, tax ledgers, and inspection benches, where every grain of spice and every bale of wool was measured, taxed, and recorded. The taxation of weight in the Byzantine period. Antioch served as a major revenue hub. Goods entering the city by land or river passed through checkpoints where officials waited with scales. The principle was simple. Weight determined not only value but also duty. A sack of saffron or pepper might be worth far more than a sack of salt, but both had to be weighed before tax could be calculated. Later, under Islamic administration, the practice continued with variations. Customs posts between Antioch and Aleppo became part of the fiscal network of the caliphate and later of regional dynasties like the Zengids and Ayyubids. Each post kept its own records, written on papyrus or parchment. Surviving fragments show lists of items, wool, olive oil, soap, cloth recorded alongside their weights and the payments extracted from them. Merchants did not welcome these stops. Each weighing took time and shaved a little from their margins. But refusal was impossible. To bypass the scale was to risk confiscation or fines. Thus, merchants built the cost into their calculations, sighing as they watched the officials move their goods piece by piece onto the balance. The politics of scales control of weights and measures was more than a matter of market fairness. It was a claim to legitimacy. Rulers from the Abbasid caliphs to local governors issued decrees about standardizing weights. Coins, too, were tied to the system, since their value depended on weight. To issue official weights was, in a sense, to assert sovereignty. In Aleppo, the mutasib, or market inspector, carried not only a set of reference weights, but also moral authority. His job was not just to prevent fraud, but to ensure that trade itself reflected the values of the community: fairness, honesty, and order. Chronicles record incidents where mutasibs publicly punished merchants caught with false weights, smashing their scales or fining them heavily. Antioch, shifting hands between Byzantines, Crusaders, and Muslim rulers, saw repeated attempts to enforce new standards. Each transition meant new calibrations, new reference weights, and sometimes confusion. A merchant traveling often had to carry several sets of weights, prepared to negotiate which pound or dirham was being applied that day. Weighing as daily survival for ordinary people. Weighing was a matter of survival. Farmers bringing sacks of grain to market relied on fair scales to secure their livelihood. Soap makers in Aleppo, producing the city's famous olive oil soaps, shipped them in blocks and crates. Each shipment was weighed before sale, and the margin between profit and loss could come down to a few pounds of mismeasurement. Porters, too, depended on weights. They charged not by distance alone, but often by the load they carried. To know that a sack weighed 60 pounds rather than 70 meant knowing whether they could carry 2 at a time or only 1. The scale, therefore, did not only regulate trait-shaped labor, exertion, and health. The invisible friction of trade. All this weighing created what historians sometimes call transaction costs. For every step a merchant took between Antioch and Aleppo, he faced new demands: weigh here, pay here, record here. The journey may have been only days long, but it was thick with interruptions. The clinking of coins into tax coffers was as constant as the clinking of goods onto scales. Yet somehow, despite the boredom and frustration, the system worked. Caravans kept moving, goods kept flowing, and markets in both cities thrived. The invisible friction of weighing and taxing was absorbed into the rhythm of commerce. Like sand in the gears of a well-worn machine, stories, hidden in ledgers surviving tax ledgers, give us small windows into this world. One list from northern Syria notes deliveries of wool and soap weighed in standard units before being taxed. The entries are repetitive, dull to the modern eye, but behind them lies the hum of real lives: shepherds who sheared flocks, soap makers who boiled cauldrons of oil, porters who shouldered crates, and clerks who dipped pens in ink to mark down each number. No poetry sings of these acts, yet they sustained the economy as surely as armies sustained empires. To copy weight after weight into a register was an act of statecraft, binding the labor of countryside and city into a single system. The problem of dishonesty, but what of fraud? Where there are scales, there are always suspicions. False weights, slightly shaved lumps of bronze, hollowed and filled with lighter material, were a constant problem. Inspectors carried their reference sets for this very reason. Merchants, too, could cheat by leaning on the scale, nudging the beam, or moistening goods to make them heavier. Pepper soaked in water might gain a few ounces. Bales of wool packed with hidden stones could weigh far more than their actual fiber content. Tales circulated in the marketplaces about cunning tricks and the punishments that followed. Fraud was not simply a moral failing. It was a threat to the fragile trust that allowed strangers to trade. Thus, enforcement had to be public and sometimes harsh. In Aleppo, merchants caught repeatedly with false measures could be banned from the market altogether. The slowness of progress. What is striking is how little the process changed over centuries. From Roman times through the Crusader era and into the Ottoman age, goods were still weighed by beam balances and steelyards. Inspectors still carried weights in pouches, and merchants still haggled nervously as the pans tipped back and forth. The repetition of it, all the endless setting of goods on scales, the endless recording of numbers can feel stifling to imagine. Yet, in that repetition lay the stability that made trade possible. The Silk Road, so often remembered for its glamour, was held together by men who spent their lives measuring sacks of grain and blocks of soap. A question of resilience here. We find ourselves facing a puzzle. How did such a fragile system endure? A dishonest inspector, a corrupt governor, or even a minor miscalculation could throw trade into disarray. Yet, trade between Antioch and Aleppo not only survived but flourished. Was it the resilience of the merchants themselves, adapting to new standards, carrying multiple weights, and absorbing constant taxes? Or was it the resilience of the cities, whose markets were so essential that traders endured the tedium of weighing and reweighing rather than abandoning the route? The answer is not entirely clear. What is clear is that behind every coin exchanged in those marketplaces, behind every exotic good that traveled to Europe or Asia, there was first the dull sound of scales settling into balance. And so, as you picture the caravans passing through Syria, perhaps the more vivid question is not about the glittering goods they carried, but this: how many times did those goods have to be weighed, measured, and taxed before they finally reached their destination? By the time you reached Aleppo, after leaving Antioch, you had not only walked a physical road, but also a road of measurements. Each toll post, each marketplace, each inspection point had added another layer of weight and number to your journey. In this final section, we follow how weighing goods shaped identity, law, and trust across centuries, and how something so mundane could form the very backbone of the Silk Road. Both Antioch and Aleppo were cities where law was visible in daily trade, whether under Byzantine, Islamic, or later Ottoman authority. Regulations about weighing were copied, announced, and enforced. Legal manuals of the time dedicate entire sections to weights and measures, listing precise conversions and penalties for fraud. In the Byzantine Book of the Eper, rules are laid down for merchants in Constantinople. And though Antioch was on the frontier, many of the same principles applied. Merchants had to use official measures stamped with authority. Inspectors carried reference sets to check compliance. Islamic jurisprudence went even further, grounding fair weights in religious principle. The Quran itself contains verses condemning those who give less than due measure. In Aleppo's markets, this moral weight hung heavy. To cheat on the scales was not only a civic crime, but a spiritual failing. The mutasib, the market inspector, stood as both administrator and moral enforcer, and so, for every sack of grain hoisted, every bale of wool laid down, there was also a silent invocation of law and faith. The scales did not only balance goods, they balanced trust, morality, and legitimacy. Merchants became identified by their mastery of local weights. A Persian trader in Aleppo might be praised or pitied, depending on how well he could navigate the bewildering conversions. In some cases, merchants carried written tables, inked onto slips of parchment, that compared the Antiochian litron with the Alpine rattle, or the Byzantine pound with the Arabic ukiya. To belong in the market was to speak the language of weights. A merchant who miscalculated too often would be excluded, not by decree, but by reputation. Others, fluent in the conversions, gained trust and better prices. Weighing thus became a silent test of credibility, as much a marker of identity as accent or clothing. Over time, the image of the scale became symbolic across the region. In Antioch's mosaics and Aleppo's carved stones, scales appeared as motifs of justice and balance. Coins sometimes bore images of scales, emphasizing fairness in trade. In Islamic art and literature, the scale also evoked the Day of Judgment, when deeds would be weighed. The humble marketplace tool thus acquired a grandeur it never possessed in daily use. A merchant lifting weights from his pouch may not have thought about divine judgment, but the larger culture constantly reminded him that every act of weighing carried both economic and moral consequences. The invisible chains of trust at a deeper level. Scales sustained trust networks. Caravans from Antioch to Aleppo might include merchants from Egypt, Armenia, or Persiamen who had never met before, who spoke different languages and came from different traditions. What allowed them to transact? Not friendship, not kinship, but the shared reliance on weights. When two strangers stood at a balance and watched the beam settle, they entered a contract grounded in numbers. The scale was their mediator, impartial and impersonal. It allowed trust to exist where otherwise suspicion might have prevailed. In this way, weighing extended beyond goods. It created invisible chains linking cities, rulers, and cultures. Each weight placed on the pan was also a weight placed in the shared system of the Silk Road. When the Ottomans took control of Syria in the 16th century, they inherited centuries of practice. Aleppo, now a jewel of the empire, became a hub for European merchants as well. The weighing of goods continued in its dull, methodical way. Ottoman records show meticulous detail about weights, taxes, and measures. Inspectors enforced uniformity across the empire, but local variation endured. Even as caravans gave way to ships and modern commerce, the old routines lingered. Scales remained in use in Aleppo's souk well into the modern period, a living link to the long history of Antioch and its road. It is easy to overlook how profoundly boring this work was. Day after day, porters lifted, inspectors checked, merchants haggled, and clerks wrote. Nothing about it was glamorous. No songs were sung about inspectors' weights. No monuments were built to the porters who strained under sacks. And yet, without this daily monotony, empires could not have thrived. Weighing goods turned chaos into order, suspicion into trust, and local markets into global networks. The Silk Road was not only about long journeys and exotic goods. It was about the endless repetition of scales tipping and beams settling. And here lies the final reflection. Weighing goods was a practice of balance, but also of fragility. A corrupted inspector, a disputed standard, a dishonest merchant, any of these could tilt the beam too far. Yet, somehow, over centuries of shifting rulers and fluctuating currencies, the system endured. Why? Perhaps because, boring as it was, people needed it. Without the scales, no merchant could prove his claim. No ruler could collect his taxes. No caravan could trust its load. The dull clatter of weights and the creak of beams became as essential to civilization as walls or roads. And so, from Antioch to Aleppo, weighing goods was the hidden heartbeat of trade. You may never see it described in chronicles of kings or battles, but its rhythm sustained markets, shaped laws, and connected strangers across cultures. The question it leaves us with is this: in our own age, what are the scales we rely on, unnoticed and that silently hold our systems together? And so our long journey comes to a quiet end. We have traveled slowly across forgotten silk roads, from the hum of Antioch scales to the silent ruins of desert towers. We have paused in markets where soap was weighed, in monasteries where ink dried on parchment, and in caravans where weary merchants drank their tea. The stories were never urgent, but they were steady. Each one was a thread woven into the great fabric of history, ordinary, patient, often overlooked. Now, as the roads fade into silence, you might let your mind wander too. The voices of guards, monks, and traders can rest once more beneath the sands of time. Thank you for listening, and may your sleep be as deep and untroubled as the quiet deserts we have crossed together.